Welcome to the Active Travel Adventures podcast. I'm your host, Kit Parks. On this show, I hope to inspire and empower you to lead a bigger life through adventure travel. And today we're doing the Sophie Diaries. This is an ongoing series that happens on the third Thursday of the month while I'm doing an extended road trip in my Sprinter camper van, Sophie. And today we have finally left the desert Southwest and are now in Colorado. So let's get started. I begin my adventure in Colorado by meeting up again with Jenny. Jenny, whom we've heard mentioned many a time on the show. She was the gal I interviewed about her hometown in Flagstaff, episode number 65. And I also visited and hiked with her several times while I was in northern Arizona. So you heard about her again on an earlier Sophie Diaries. And she has a place also as well in southwestern Colorado. And luckily, the timing worked out perfectly that both she and her husband, Paul, were going to be there the day that I happened to arrive in Colorado. To get there, though, I have to drive through the last of my Utah deserts and the Navajo Nation. It's desolate out there, and to explore any of the canyons, it looks like you need four-wheel drive. And I don't see any towns to stay in on my way east from Natural Bridge National Monument, where we left off on the last episode, so I make a beeline for Cortez, Colorado. I decided to get a hotel tonight, but just before I reach town, I see a Ute Nation casino and travel stop. Often, they'll even let you park overnight in a casino area, so I pull in just to explore the area. And while I probably could have parked in the parking lot at no charge, I see they also have an RV park, and I sure would like to take a nice hot shower. Plus, the sign promises good Wi-Fi. I quickly discover that this is the nicest RV park I've ever been in. Although, granted, I haven't stayed in a whole lot of them. I've stayed in a lot of campgrounds, but RV parks are different. They're usually lined up like canned sardines. It's not my cup of tea. But they do usually allow a pull-in, so those big buses fit in them much better than they do in a campground. But this particular one has some trees, and this is a major plus because I haven't seen a whole lot of trees in the last 6 weeks, and it's very tidy. The office even has a lounge area that's got magazines, coffee, a TV, and most importantly, unlike virtually all the campgrounds I've visited in the last couple of months, they have a spot available for me. And the one thing I love that for the shower, I had my own dressing room and shower, which is beautifully tiled. I just love the whole cleanliness and privacy of this place. This spot was well worth the money. In the morning, I got a bunch of work done on the show and then headed over to Jenny's. What a change in the landscape. I see my first of a gazillion aspen trees. They haven't yet fleshed out yet because spring is just inching its way here at this elevation. There's still some snow on the north sides of the mountains. I also see rivers, and they're raging with all the recent snow melt. I didn't see any that I'd feel comfortable even crossing at these high levels. The woods are also full of spruce and fir and an occasional pine. This is a complete contrast to the landscape of the desert and even the high mountain ponderosa forest of Flagstaff. I drive through some cute little western towns and arrive at Jenny's a little bit early. This gives me plenty of time for a quick nap. I have definitely picked up honoring siesta time midday, especially after all this time I've spent in the desert. We have a great reunion when Jenny and Paul arrive, and I keep them up way too late. I feel sorry for the poor people I see after I haven't had any socialization in a while. In the morning, Jenny and I go hike to an area that she wants to scope out as an area that she thinks she and Paul might want to go backpacking in. It's right along a really nice river that they can fish in. It's pretty, there's areas of sun, yet there's plenty of trees for shade. Also, it seems like hardly anyone is using this section of the San Juan National Forest. On the way up the trail, we see some elk in a stream. That was a real treat. I asked Jenny, when did she think the aspen and the other deciduous trees would leaf out? And she isn't sure because this is her first spring since she and Paul bought the house in Colorado. On the way back, we noticed that during that day that we were hiking, while we were out there hiking and the sun came out, that was the day that the aspen would flush out and the mountainsides were covered in green and not bare like they were just that morning during our ride up to the mountain. That was cool. I've been chasing spring as I move north, and it's been fun to witness the trees leafing out and all the early spring wildflowers. This area, like all of western Colorado, is loaded with hiking and mountain biking trails. Yet more confirmation that I want to live near mountains when I finish my travels, although most likely it's going to be on the East Coast. And speaking of bikes, I want to get new tires for my hybrid bike. Jenny notices immediately that the tread of my bike stink. I don't know about these things, and my tires are pretty new, so it didn't register that this had anything to do with that bad fall I had back in March. When we take my bike to her favorite bike shop, she notices that the tires are super hard. I exclaimed that I had pumped them to the recommended tire pressure on the sides of the tires. Jenny believes that this is another reason I'm having some gripping problems on the surfaces where I'm biking. The bike masters concur and explain that on uneven terrain, you lower the tire pressure so that the tire squishes down more, giving you some more surface space, and to create more surface space and tread to grip the surface that you're biking. This makes total sense. I just never thought through the concept before. And not being real familiar with bikes, I was trying to, quote-unquote, follow the rules. My tires recommended 60 psi, yet this guy says he thought 35 psi would be better, and even less, maybe 30 psi on the front tire. Who knew? Obviously, I was doing this all wrong. And this is for when I'm on gravel or any other uneven surface, not on pavement, of course. So at the shop, I bought 2 new tires that had a lot more tread in the middle and a ton more tread on the outside edges. It seems like you have to trade off speed and performance for grip. The company, Coco Belly Bikes, works with the local schools to help kids get bikes, so they were happy to find a home for my old tires, which are still in great shape just for road purposes only. After a lovely visit with Paul and Jenny, it's time to head west. The next person I want to see is listener Shar in Durango. However, to get there, on both Shar and Jenny's recommendation, I take the long scenic ride up through Telluride, and then on the way to Ouray and over the San Juan Skyway over to Silverton. The ride to Telluride is spectacular, and I'm so glad that I listened once again to the locals' advice. They know, and I've learned just let them tell me what I should be doing. I can tell by the downtown shops when I arrive at the popular ski town that I'm glad that I'm in between seasons, so things are pretty quiet. At Jenny's suggestion as well, I book a really sweet campsite at the town's campground. This is perfect as I'm in walking distance to downtown. Town is pretty quiet, like I mentioned, and it's taking a breather between the ski season and early spring, and a lot of the shops are taking a well-deserved vacation. The streets are pretty quiet, then all of a sudden the foot traffic picks up suddenly for some reason. And then I hear sirens pealing away, and really slowly a fire truck makes its way up the main drag. As it passes, I find out why all of a sudden so many people have hit the streets. It's a parade for the new graduates. What a lovely way to commemorate their achievement. Seeing the happy faces of grads, parents, and parents on their little floats and cars really brought a lump to my throat. For dinner, I look for a restaurant that has a dine-in bar area. My first choice turned out just to be a bar. And I want to find a restaurant that has a bar. That's what I like to go to, so I have somebody to talk to. So the bartender sends me across the street to the Floridora Saloon. It's a fine choice, it turns out. The food is great. I have salmon tacos, and I sit next to, it turns out, the head chef of one of the area's fine restaurants along with his friend, and we have a nice chat over a couple of beers. I eventually tell him that I like to eat dinner at a restaurant bar when I need socialization, and I call whomever I chat with my 2-hour friends. I also tell him that he was my victim for tonight. This both startles and humors him so much that he snorts the beer out of his nose. And the 3 of us have a good laugh at the sprayed bar. I also get advice from the bartender Chelsea. She recommended that I hike the Bear Creek Trail, which I'm able to pick up right downtown, so that's my next hike. I get an early start as usual, and even though this is an extremely popular trail, I have it mostly to myself this early. About halfway up, I come to what appears to be damage from an avalanche. A massive swath of aspen are laid down like a giant just swept his hand across the forest and pushed down all the trees like dominoes. If somebody was unfortunate enough to be snowshoeing when it happened, I don't see how one could swim like they tell you to do in an avalanche and survive. I am humbled by the power that nature and weather can bring after witnessing such power. At the top, I'm rewarded with a beautiful waterfall and stream. The sole hiker that was sitting there when I arrived leaves, so I have a nice quiet snack break, sitting enjoying the river and surrounding snow-capped mountains. It was delightful. By the time I return to the trailhead, the crowds are starting, heading up to have lunch, I'm guessing, up where I had my private snack break. After a few days exploring the area, it was time to cross that somewhat scary Red Mountain Pass between Ouray and Silverton. Ouray is a cool mountain town and a worthy destination of its own. It's called the Switzerland of America for good reason. It's charming, and thus attracts lots of tourists for its views and outdoor attractions, including hot springs. Next, I'm to cross the Red Mountain Pass, also known as the $1 Million Highway. This high mountain road, I've been warned, can be scary. The 2-lane road is skinny with no shoulder or guardrails, and in many places there's a sheer drop-off below that can give some people vertigo. It's also high and can snow at any time. You're advised to check weather conditions before crossing. Naturally, I have no cell service, and unfortunately, the visitor center is closed. So I'm debating. Crossing this beautiful pass is one reason I chose this long way to Durango. I decide to try it, and if I get too scared, I'll just turn around and go the really long way back around. There's a beautiful mountain overlook of Ouray as you climb the first mountain, and I pull over to take a closer and safer look. None of the other tourists milling about up there have checked the weather either. We aren't too bright. While there's no snow on the roads, at least at this point, the mountains up this high are covered in snow. But I decide to continue on. Fortunately, even though the roads are skinny, they have multiple side pullouts that fit a car or two, and I just pull over every time somebody gets behind me so I can simply take my time and enjoy the view safely. I'm super high at around 11,000 feet. It takes your breath away, and not just because the air is so thin up here. This drive is so worth it. And then it starts to snow. Insert some bad words here. It's coming down pretty hard, but thus far it's not sticking to the road, and I figure it's 6 of one and half a dozen of the other if I turn around, because I'm already halfway through the pass. So I continue on, and eventually the snow stops, and I breathe a sigh of relief. But that doesn't last too long, because 15 minutes later it starts snowing hard again. At least on this section, I'm now hugging the mountain instead of being out on the exposed cliffside, so I feel a bit more comfortable, and Sophie's up to the challenge. She tackles mountains great. She's got a very strong Freightliner truck engine, and I have complete confidence in her keeping me safe. That doesn't mean I wasn't happy to finally make it to Silverton. I'm glad that Char told me to leave the highway and check out the town, because it's as cute as you can imagine a Victorian old western town can look. It looks out of the movies, and apparently a lot have been filmed in this whole area. I have cell service, and I see a text came in from Char advising me that the pass I just crossed was closed the day before due to snow. I'm glad I didn't see this text until I was through it, or I might have been too chicken to cross it, and now I'm very glad that I did. Pictures just don't do this area justice. Char is out of town till tomorrow, so I need to find a place to stay for the evening. I pull into a campground that shows up on my iOverlander app and then call the number. Apparently, you have to make reservations at least a day in advance, even if they have open spaces. And I say to myself, I keep running into this 1 to 3 day issue with campgrounds on this trip. They specifically state on the message that I can't stay without a previous reservation. So I'm going to have to come up with a plan B for where to stay tonight. I need groceries, and I go to a Walmart in Durango. After I check out, I ask the gal minding the self-checkout if they allow overnighters, and the lady said one night's probably okay. In season? I'm guessing not, but we're not in season yet. So I parked in the back parking lot and thought it was odd there's not another RV there. One comes along, but after an hour they leave. I feel very vulnerable and alone out in that parking lot, because you're exposed. People see you and you're in town. Towns always make me more nervous in the wild. So I take out my weapon wasp spray and consider going to a hotel instead. So then I get the idea to just Google Walmart RV, Durango, and I find a website that says that due to bad RVers' behavior, that during the season, Walmart does not allow RVs, but off-season, if you park by the tire center, it's usually okay. So I head over there and see a few RVs and campers, and as time goes on, more show up, and now I'm feeling safe having others around me. I've never stayed overnight at a Walmart before, but like Cracker Barrel, Bass Pro Shops, Cabela's, most will let you spend a night or two in the back of the parking lot. Of course, as a way to say thanks, buy something, be a good neighbor, stay in your vehicle, meaning don't set out chairs, make loud noises, or make a mess. A hot parking lot is not my idea of fun, but still cold at night, so that wasn't an issue for me. Plus, I just simply need a place to park Sophie. I had all my water and electric needs. One thing I quickly noticed is that gas and beer is much cheaper in Colorado versus Utah. I think the alcohol has a Mormon sin tax on it, and I'm guessing the gas must be taxed higher as well, because the price difference for both is significant. In the morning, I go to see Char, a longtime ADA listener. She and I have been emailing back and forth for over a year. When we finally meet, it's like seeing an old friend. En route, I explored the beautiful town of Durango, a modern western town with Fort Lewis College to give it an especially cool vibe. Surrounded by mountains, bordered by the Animas River, on which there's a lovely greenway, I could live here if it didn't get so cold. In the distance, you see the chiseled white-capped Rockies. It looks photoshopped. Char's family, her husband Brandon and son Casey, are equally welcoming to the stranger Char has invited into their lovely rural home. How lucky to see such beautiful mountains whenever they look out the window or just work in the yard. I helped Char make a dessert for a funeral. It's a family recipe that looks yummy. While she's at the funeral, I get some work done, but later in the afternoon, I interrupt Brandon while he's doing some dirt work, repairing the stairs and landing to their Airbnb that they're letting me use. After chatting a bit, we realize I've ruined his work for the day anyway, so we head to his cool man cave, it's a converted garage, and have a local IPA and wait for Char to come home. Char, like me, is a plant person, and I'm envious of her gardens and greenhouse. One day, when I finally settle down again, I will once again have the same. It's something I sorely miss while being a vagabond. Also, seeing everyone's nice homes and the clever ways they've fixed them up stirs up homebody juices that I keep pressing down to stay dormant so that I can get the bulk of my travels in before I buy a house again. I don't mind being on the road or living in a camper in the least, but there are times I miss having a home I can entertain in and putz around in the yard. So while I'm in somebody's home, I do enjoy it while I can. Dinner was a delicious artichoke and bacon pizza that I will order in the future. I loved it. The next morning, Char takes me to one of her favorite trails. We bring the 2 dogs, one of which is a year-old shepherd named Milo. Char says he walks so quietly, she attached a Tibetan bell to his collar so she could hear him. We've been hiking for a while when we notice we no longer hear the bell. Char calls the dogs and teases how if she lost Milo, she couldn't face Casey because it's his dog. After a few minutes, still no dogs. Eventually, the older dog arrives breathless, but still no sign of the puppy Milo. We each get a bit nervous and antsy calling his name. Char hits the interior of the forest, worried that Milo's leash has gotten caught on a tree and he can't break free. I volunteered to head back down and look for him there. I check wildlife paths. I go in maybe like 50 to 100 feet, but I don't know these woods and I don't want to get lost either. That morning when we arrived, however, I did pin the location of the car on my Apple Map app, so I'd always be able to find my way back to the car, if ever I needed to. And that's a good tip anytime you're unfamiliar with the terrain. I'm reminded of my friend Jerry who got lost in the Appalachian Trail and perished. I try to use the lessons learned so I don't get lost. I'll put a link to that Adventure Travel Show podcast episode on what to do if you get lost in the woods in the show notes. It's a really important show that everybody should listen to. I feel like I'm being useless help, but then I get the idea that maybe the puppy found the trail, and with the 50-50 guess if he reached the trail, which way to follow Char's scent, he might have picked the wrong one. But I no longer can hear Char calling the dog, as we're now too far apart, and I need to communicate with her. So I take a business card out of my pack, write her a note telling her that I'm heading downhill on the trail, and then using some neon survey tape that I keep in my emergency kit, I attach my note with the tape to a stick and leave it right in the trail so she can't miss it. Otherwise, Char would have no idea if I was heading north or south of her. Without being able to communicate, we would be losing each other. And there, about a mile down the mountain, is Milo the puppy, sitting passively on the trail, just waiting to be rescued. Gratefully, he doesn't run when he sees me and allows me to walk him on a leash back up the mountain. He's dehydrated, so I try to give him some water by trying to find some kind of rounded rock, and he greedily slurps it up. It's going to have to do until we find a stream. Char still can't hear me, but as we rise higher, I check my phone. I got cell service. So I text Char the good news, and eventually we can hear each other for the happy reunion. Frazzled, plus Char still had to work that afternoon, we decided to call it a hike. I'm supposed to leave in the morning, but since we aborted our hike to Goody's Rest, I decided to go back on my way out and hike it solo. And I'm sure glad I did. Goody Gaskill, for whom Goody's Rest is named, is considered the mother of the epic Colorado Trail, a 567-mile trail from Durango to Denver. On a particularly beautiful viewpoint, said to be her favorite place to sit and contemplate, there's a bench in her honor which overlooks the valley below. It was well worth the climb. While I was hiking up there, I saw no one but a couple of mountain bikers. But of course, I happened to arrive at the bench at the same time another woman did, coming from a different direction. But it turns out she was a native of the area and grew up on a local ranch. We chatted about the growth she's seen in this beautiful area. She didn't like how so many others were now discovering the beauty of the Durango area, so I made sure not to mention that I'd be talking about that very thing on this podcast. But I get her point of view, though. You want to keep these special finds a secret. After my hike, I then head towards Salida to visit Becky Rupp. Becky is my affiliate and online personal trainer extraordinaire and owner of Trailblazer Wellness. Becky can custom design a training program using the equipment and training access you already have to help ensure that your body is ready to tackle whatever your adventure plans are. Believe me, it's no fun to struggle every day to keep up with your adventure group or goals. It's so much better to have your body muscles, heart, and lungs fine-tuned to the activity you have planned, plus it also reduces your chance of injury. At the end of the day, you want to be happy tired, not dead tired. I'll put a link to reach Becky in the show notes. Be sure to mention ADA and you'll get a special 10% discount. Plus, you'll be helping to support the show at no additional cost to you. Once again, trusting local knowledge, I took the scenic route which took me through Wolf Pass at over 10,000 feet and where I would cross the Continental Divide. At the divide, I took a picture of my feet straddling it. On my left, the waters would head towards the Mississippi or Rio Grande, and on the right, they'd rush towards the Colorado River. Pretty cool. I have to say I've been pretty proud of Sophie, my converted Sprinter cargo van, on how she can tackle all the high mountain passes I've been coming through. She climbs like she was born for it. Sometimes the grades going downhill are quite steep, and I'm talking 8% grade, and it can go for 10 miles or more. I choose to go slowly so I can savor the view, and I'm always pulling aside so folks can pass me. Char tells me 2 tips for turnoffs. The first looks nondescript, and I surely would have bypassed it. It's a small turnout to see these beautiful falls. There's a short but steep quarter-mile hike that gives you a fantastic view of the falls. She also tells me that after 2 sharp hairpin turns to go into the parking area on the left for a knockout view. Again, when you're driving on these skinny mountain roads that twist and turn so tightly, seemingly going straight up or down, you don't often dare to cross the road to pull off. But again, Char had the scoop. As far as the eye could see, and with typical Colorado clear blue skies, breathtaking. It's a shame cameras, or at least my iPhone camera, can't quite capture the beauty. It's hard to gauge distance with these massive views. I noticed this first when I was en route to Flagstaff. I could see the snow-capped mountain from 55 miles away, and I know that only because there was a sign saying Flagstaff 55, and that's where the mountain was. I found the same thing when I was heading to Great Sand Dunes National Monument. My GPS said to head straight 16 miles, and I was like, I'm going to be running right into that mountain if I do. But sure enough, when you're on a flat plateau with these gigantic mountains that come straight out of the ground, 14,000 feet high, it's really deceptive. But of course, the GPS was right. I'm not due to arrive at Becky's until the next day, so I take a detour to check out the U.S. tallest sand dunes. Yep, here in Colorado of all places. The rocky landscape soon turns to scrub-dotted grassy plains and then to sandy soiled plains. The heavy winds across the plains blows the sand east where it hits the tall Rockies, and then the sand drops down before forming these gigantic sand dunes. This I've got to see. And I learned from a Facebook friend from Paula of the Wind River and the Mummy Range episodes, I'll put links in the show notes, that you could sled down these dunes. I had so much fun sledding down Cerro Negro in Nicaragua a few years ago, again I'll also put a link in the show notes, that I know I've got to try this. The day is cloudy and therefore cooler than a typical day, but it's really windy. And I figure it's going to be unpleasant and I'm going to feel like I'm being sandblasted if I go today. So I figure I better just go there first thing in the morning. And luckily, the local campground, A, has plenty of spaces, and B, they'll rent sleds and sand surfboards. So I decided I'll just take care of everything with them. This is one of the few campgrounds I've found with openings. And I figure it's because it's a national monument and they're not as popular as the national parks. This is very good information. I decided to visit more monuments and less parks, as they're just as cool as the parks, even if it's just to see an anomaly in nature, and only for a day. To beat the heat, and these dunes can register 140 degrees Fahrenheit or 60 degrees Celsius, The next morning, I am first in line to rent a board. The dunes are just a few miles away. When I get there, a few locals who own their boards or others who rented overnight to get there even earlier have already started up these huge dunes. To get there, though, first you have to cross a shallow but wide river. I imagine in the summer it's a dry bed, but as the snows are melting on the adjacent Rockies, for now there really is a cold stream to cross. Then comes the slog. Walking in deep, dry sand is hard and tiring. You get a real workout for your lungs. But when you get on top of whichever dune you want to ride down, first you rub the bottom with wax in a zigzag pattern, and then you put the board on the sand and then rub that on the sand to spread that wax using the warmth and the friction. And they give you the wax when you rent the board. Then you sit on this foam-mounted seat, grab the side handles, and then scooch forward until you tip down. You put your feet at the end of the board, and mind you, they tell you don't ride face first because you're liable to eat a lot of sand. And then you fly down the dune. Steering, I found, was a bit hard with these boards, and actually I think the front rope that we use in the Nicaragua boards and our feet as our little steering and brakes worked a little bit better. And sometimes you're going to tip over. There's no way to go around that because you don't have complete control. But like I said, with using your feet as brakes, you're not going to get hurt. It's a lot of fun, but after each ride, up the sand dunes you got to climb again for the next run. It's fun, but it's exhausting, and after a couple hours, I've had enough of this fun. The board is mine till 4 p.m., but I return it well before noon and grab a shower before my campsite checkout. Then off to Salida. I get there early enough to scout out the town before I head to Becky's. It's charming and alive. Now that COVID restrictions are easing, folks are outside and in restaurants. I'm hoping that all the new outdoor dining areas remain post-COVID. I can't be the only one who prefers to eat outside. The Arkansas River runs through Salida, and I learned that it's the most popular commercially rafted river in the country. So booking a whitewater rafting trip before I leave is a must-do. At Becky's recommendation, I book a half-day rafting trip through Browns Canyon with independent whitewater. I'm delighted they can fit me in on such short notice and on Memorial Day weekend. They're calling for rain on Sunday afternoon, so I decided to take the morning run. The locals tell me I'm going to be cold. It's now the beginning of June, and spring is just emerging around here. They highly recommend that I rent the wetsuit, and I appreciate the local knowledge. When I arrive, I find I can rent not only the wetsuit, but booties and a splash jacket, so for a nominal fee, I say I'll take all the above. The splash jacket is new to me. It's like a rain jacket, but it has an adjustable rubber neckline and waistline to keep the cold water out. My guide, Michael, recommends I switch to a baseball cap under my helmet. I also bring along my mother's kayaking neoprene gloves, which I'm later glad that I did. When the sun came out, I would get a little warm, but since we're mostly in the clouds, I stayed quite comfortable in my getup. We raft 12 miles, actually 2 miles further than the other rafting companies, because the original company owner allows independent whitewater to pull up on his property further down the river. It appears he also helps out in the season, as Bill, the former owner, was also our transport driver for the put-in. He sold the company a while back to his favorite rafting guide. Becky was also right about which trip to take, as there are several choices in this area. The water levels today are perfect for a nice and exciting but not dangerous ride at 879 cubic feet per minute. Michael tells me that in a couple of weeks, that snowmelt is going to drop that river temperature by 8 degrees, and the water levels will rise to their peak. The high water levels will increase the roughness of the river and create some Class 5s in most years. They had a record snowfall a few years back, and the CFM was several times today's flow. Browns Canyon is like? It appears, like all parts of this beautiful state, gorgeous. Chunky round granite slabs stack up the sides of the canyon. There are a fair amount of trees as well, which make for a pretty contrast to the rugged rock. Former owner Bill named many of the rocks that we come across that have interesting shapes. There's Peeing Bear, a lion, lying buffalo, old lady, and more. Bill seems quite good at finding patterns in the rock, as once Mike tells me the name, I can see it right away. The Class 2 to Class 4 rapids we go through have fun names too, like Pinball, Zoom Flume, and Hemorrhoid Rock. I guess that last one is a pain in the you-know-what for the guides. Ditto another river rock called Raft Shredder. In addition, there's a rock you can jump off, it's about 15 feet high, and there's a rapid that's safe enough that you can swim through if you ask your guide. Further along the river, I found it amusing that atop a large river boulder, a lone scrawny pine tree, definitely a Charlie Brown tree, is appropriately decorated by the river guides. During our ride, Mike is good about advising us what to do should we get tossed from the boat on a given rapid. Where old railroad debris, including rebar, jutting out is along the left side, he reminds us to swim to the right. Ditto on a particularly dicey stretch where he cautions us to swim like heck to the left because the canyon rock undercuts the river on the right so you can get stuck under there. This is obviously good information to know and another reason I like to use a local guide. They also know about submerged obstacles like fallen trees and sieves. A sieve can be any feature that forces water through a tight space, and they can be very dangerous. I asked Michael what you call those whirlpools that form on the other side of large river boulders that can suck you under and keep you there. He explains that some are smiley faces, and they, like a smile, swing you out, thus they're the good kind. Unfortunately, there's others which are frowny faces, and they can hold you under. That's the kind I'd heard about before. And of course, that's the guide's job, is to make sure they don't go near any rocks that have the frowny faces. It was a great run, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. Once we were back at the office, and I got changed into dry clothes, Michael recommends that I have some lunch over at the Dive in the food truck restaurant across the street that sits along the river. Locals know, so that's where I head. Also at Mike's recommendation, I ordered the pulled pork sandwich. I come from North Carolina where we know our pulled pork, and this competes with any I've had. Although I'm used to a vinegar sauce instead of the barbecue sauce it was served with, both are tasty, and I decided to pair it with a local beer, a green chili flavored IPA from Soul Craft Brewery. I wasn't sure what it would taste like, but after the first taste shock, that first sip, I found I really liked it and I would definitely order it again. But I should have brought my raincoat to the Dive because as soon as I finished lunch, not only had it started to pour and lightning, but it also had some hail mixed in. I waited a bit, but it wasn't going to stop, so I eventually just ran through it back to Sophie. I wanted to make it to see Royal Gorge outside of Canyon City. What a beautiful drive along the river to get there. And I saw what I thought was a rare opening in a federal campsite along the river and made a U-turn, figured I'd just stay there for the night. But it was a day-use only park, so I headed back towards the gorge. When I got to Canyon City, what I thought was a nice historical town that didn't seem overly touristy for a change, despite its proximity to the popular Royal Gorge, the weather, if anything, had gotten worse and was now foggy. The distant mountains were almost completely cloud-covered, and I didn't feel like spending $50 to ride through the clouds. There's a train that takes you on a tour of the entire canyon, or you can pay what I think is a pretty steep price to walk across a bridge over the canyon. So I was going to do the train ride, but with this poor visibility, I decided to take a pass on both and instead just find a place to spend the night. Using my iOverlander app, I found a great spot just north of town in a BLM area called Penrose Common. The gravel road to get there was about 3 miles, which is longer than I normally like to take Sophie on, but it was in great condition until I actually got to the BLM land. So I continued on and only had a half mile of bumpy but definitely rideable road. And I snagged a beautiful campsite right near the pit toilet, which was another plus. There's a reservoir further down the road, and I saw boats heading home for the day. And there must be a lot of 4x4 riding in this area as well, because I saw tons of those coming in. The rain continued through the night, so I wasn't in any rush to head up to Colorado Springs, where I was to meet listener Casey for lunch. I chose the scenic route to get there and meandered up there in record slow time so I could enjoy the views. Once in the city, Sophie did an odd thing. A couple of times that morning, she stalled when I was going like 0 to 5 miles per hour. She'd start right back up again, but I didn't like this new development. So far, she's been completely reliable. I got so uncomfortable with this new erratic stalling that I drove to the restaurant where I was meeting Casey, my flashers on, and whenever I stopped, I rolled down my window so I could hand wave a secondary warning if I stalled. And wouldn't you know that once I started this new safety system, Sophie stopped stalling. I figured I'd take her to the nearby Mercedes dealership after lunch. Lunch, I must say, was outstanding. Casey recommended that we eat at Pig Latin Cucina and that we get her favorite Pig Latin platter. It's a sizable portion of mojo pork, rice, black beans, fried plantains, and a spicy island sauce. It was the best Caribbean meal I can recall having, and I was delighted to have enough left over for a second meal. Thanks, Casey. Casey, I found out, also has a podcast called She Sparks Tech, where she covers women using technology in their careers and the paths that got them where they are. So if you're a techie or love business success stories, check out her show. Again, it's She Sparks Tech, and I'll put a link in the show notes. One thing I love about Casey is that she's very methodical, probably why she's an electrical engineer. Once she found Ada, she had to go back to the beginning and listen to the shows in order. I hope she's seen some improvement in my delivery. I remember how nervous I was, at least for the first 20-some-odd episodes. I'm not sure I even took a breath. So if you listen to my older shows, please give me some grace. After a nice long lunch, it was time to find the Mercedes garage. It was only 12 miles away, and there was 2 routes. I could go the interstate to save some time, but I was worried about Sophie misbehaving, especially in this hard rain, so I chose the back streets, even though it meant more stops. I exited the parking lot a different way than the GPS first directed me, and I didn't realize that it rerouted me back to the interstate until I was almost there, and Sophie had stalled a couple times. You never heard so many Our Fathers and Hail Marys coming from a lapsed Catholic before. I was a nervous wreck and tightly gripped that wheel as I prayed to make it to the dealership and not cause an accident. Then things got worse, and the engine light came on, and the van went into limp mode. Limp mode, I found out the hard way, is a safety mechanism that doesn't allow the vehicle to go more than second gear to protect the engine and makes you go to the garage for servicing. At this point, I only had a few more miles to go, and I just wanted to get there as fast as I could. I did not want to backtrack all those miles. I decided to go the GPS way onto the interstate. I could always ride the shoulder if I had to. And like I expected, the highway was quiet because of the holiday, and even better yet, as I entered the highway, Sophie exited limp mode. I was able to hold proper speed. In no time, I exited the highway, and then she went back into limp mode. Talk about answered prayers. My sister swears I have an angel looking after me. I don't disagree and consider my interstate adventure a minor miracle. I limped the last couple of miles into the dealership only to find that the service department was closed for the holiday, even though the sales department was open. I had no plans to drive Sophie any further, so I didn't ask whether or not I could sleep in the parking lot until they opened. I figured this was a great occasion to exercise the maxim, it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. I took one of the last open parking spots, too close to the sales office for my preference, but at this point, I couldn't be choosy. How could they not notice me? But it was so rainy, I doubt anyone would want to come out in the rain to investigate, and this turned out to be true. I arrived around 2:30 p.m., and around 4 o'clock I started to relax. At 5, I felt really comfortable, even though they didn't close till 7. So I decided it was happy hour and popped open a beer and made some cheese and crackers. 7 came and went, and still nobody cared. Then I made my dinner. Then I went to bed around 9:30 with plans to be at the service desk when they opened at 7. I had a blissfully, thankfully uneventful night. While the service department was very nice, I was informed that this dealership wasn't certified to work on sprinters, so I'd have to take it to the one in Denver, over 85 miles away. Yuck. I have AAA, so I started the process only to be told that while my vehicle was covered because of COVID, I couldn't ride with the driver and I'd have to find my own transportation. In situations like this, I try to tackle and solve one problem at a time, in order. And these problems in order, as I saw, was 1, I had to get Sophie towed to the Mercedes dealership, Westminster. There was another one that was 15 miles closer, but the Westminster one was bigger and had a service fleet of sprinters, so I figured I had a better chance of getting serviced in and out of there faster. Number 2, I had to get to Denver. I found there's a daily bus, but that bus left before Sophie got picked up. Then I saw there was a train, and that left shortly after my tow driver showed up, so that was my alternate plan B. But my true plan A of problem 2 was to offer the driver $20 for a lift. Fortunately, plan A worked great, and Brian was not only a kind man who would have given me a ride for nothing, I'm sure, he was also very interesting and I enjoyed our conversation and drive. Now that the first 2 problems are solved, I had to worry about where to sleep. Burton, my sprinter rep at the Westminster Mercedes dealership, couldn't have been more helpful. Knowing that I live in Sophie, he tried to jiggle a schedule so that the tech could check out Sophie today, but that didn't work out. So he just let me stay in the parking lot. So now, until Sophie gets fixed, I don't have any other problems to worry about. You know, I think that going on all these adventures that I have and facing the assorted obstacles I encounter make dealing with this kind of trouble in a calmer, puzzle-solving, one step or problem at a time kind of a way easier. This glitch reminds me of an episode I did in the Adventure Travel Show podcast on grit and resilience. I think it's one of my better shows, and if you haven't already listened to it, I encourage you to do so. I'll put a link in the show notes. The whole time I was thinking, thank God I wasn't in the middle of nowhere, and Sophie had the decency to wait until I was in civilization. But even that's solvable. It'd just be more of a pain in the neck, with no cell service and often no people around even to ask for help. Almost all problems are solvable, and I think that if you tackle them with a sense of curiosity and as a game, it makes life a heck of a lot less frustrating. I was never in any danger, with the possible exception of entering the highway if Sophie was still in limp mode, so there really wasn't anything that Mr. MasterCard couldn't solve. I never felt stressed out over it, and I knew that this too shall pass. But unfortunately, I would simply miss out of exploring Colorado Springs. As it turns out, the famous Pikes Peak summit was closed for building renovations, so I wouldn't have been able to see that anyway. I did miss Garden of the Gods and a few other places I wanted to see, but hopefully I'll see them in another visit. The next day, I was supposed to go hiking in Rocky Mountain National Park with Sherry Ott of Ott's World and one of her girlfriends. Obviously, I had no transport, but luckily the dealership was right on the interstate on the way to the park, so this worked out fine. It's a beautiful drive. In fact, I haven't seen anything in western Colorado that isn't beautiful, come to think of it. The plan was to hike Ouzel Falls in the Wild Basin Trail. This area is supposedly less crowded. En route, we drove through the cute town of Leon, which if time permits is worth wandering around for a bit. Taking a wrong turn, we also drove through Estes Park, the gateway to Rocky Mountain National Park. It's a cute but naturally touristy town. I actually rather enjoyed taking the scenic route that we took to the trailhead. Sherry had just bought this car, and when we got to the gravel road, it didn't take too long to see that this road's a mess. Definitely not recommended for two-wheel drive, and a high clearance would be a good idea as well. We had to drive about 4 miles along this heavily rutted and potholed road. Carolyn, Sherry's friend, and I said we didn't mind walking, but Sherry felt confident that if she went slowly enough, the car would be fine. A ranger drove by and advised that the road was going to get worse still before it got better. Yikes, how could a road get much worse? Happily, we eventually did make it and were shocked to see it was a huge and full parking lot. I would have thought most people would have turned around once they saw the road conditions. This bad road reminded me of the National Forest Service outside of Flagstaff. However, there they close the roads when they're this wet from the snow melt. I was surprised that the forest up here didn't follow suit. It didn't take long for me to understand why so many people persevered. This trail was loaded with bulging, raging water as the snow-capped mountains melted into spring. The rangers at the trailhead advised us to keep away from the wet rocks at the river's edge so we didn't accidentally get swept downstream in the surge. They also said that unless we had spikes for our shoes, there's still snow and ice near the top of the trail. So we decided just to hike to the highest waterfall we could without having to hike on snow and ice. The trail crosses the river multiple times via a nice sturdy bridge, which gave us a great vantage point of the roaring river below. The trees had recently flushed out, so we were surrounded by fresh green aspen leaves as well as the pines, firs, and spruce. It was a gorgeous hike that while it had around 500-foot elevation gain, it was so gradual that I thought it was a pretty easy hike. Caroline, a climber, scrambled up a large boulder when we reached the waterfall and found us a great spot for lunch away from the crowds. After a leisurely lunch, it was a quick descent back to the car. One good thing about driving this slowly is that you have time to see things, and Carolyn spotted 2 young moose over on the right. It was fun watching them as we crawled back to the highway. There was a favorite distillery of Sherry's on the way home, so we decided to stop in to check it out. I generally don't drink the hard stuff, but I ordered some fancy whiskey drink that I must say was delicious. Carolyn ordered us a meat and cheese platter, so we noshed on that as well while we enjoyed the fresh air under the open-sided tent out back. One of the silver linings of COVID is that most restaurants have built some kind of outdoor seating area, and I sure hope they keep them now that the pandemic is waning. And I doubt I'm the only one. I'll sit outside even when it's cold. That's something that struck me in Berlin during a cold late winter visit. In the morning at the cafe, folks would sit outside in freezing weather to drink their coffee rather than sit in the heated shop. Thick blankets were provided. I love this, but doubt we'll see it trending in the U.S. Back at the dealership, I learned that Sophie needs some parts that would take several days to get here. So it appears I'm going to be living at the Mercedes dealership for a while. But it actually worked out fine. I had excellent cell coverage, plus they gave me a private office during the day. There was a Planet Fitness a couple of miles away, so I could get a shower whenever I wanted, and there's a super long greenway adjacent to the dealership, so getting some exercise in was easy as well. Restaurants were just 2 blocks away. I thought I was sitting pretty. But I also wanted to meet Lori, a listener I've been emailing many times over the years. In fact, it was Lori who connected me to Kristen of Travel Past 50, who came on to tell us about her Galapagos and her bike in the Stiletto Heel of Italy adventures. The dealership loaned me a car for the weekend. And it's funny, I'm so used to driving older vehicles that I didn't know how to use all the fancy electronics. I couldn't figure out how to lower the volume on the radio, but gratefully did finally figure that out. I had the unfortunate bad timing to arrive in the Denver area on moving week for Lori. There probably wasn't a worse week to be in town with the exception of the previous week, packing week, I'm sure. But Lori is very gracious, and we arranged for me to drive an hour down to see her on Saturday night. I would break in the guest room, and her husband Joel would have reason to assemble the grill. I'm sure he was thrilled. Lori and Joel bought a lovely home in a new development that is super convenient to everything. I'm sure once they get settled in, they're going to love it. What I loved most is on top of their third floor is a large rooftop terrace. That's the whole footprint of their home. Wow. You can see the Rockies in the distance. Wow. Joel is a big fisherman, and he especially likes to fish for salmon. In fact, he grilled us some salmon that he himself had caught. Along with some corn, potatoes, and salad, it was a feast. The next day, Lori and I set out to hike. We'd had a thunderstorm last night that dumped a lot of rain, so our originally planned trail was going to be too muddy. So off we headed to her Plan B trail. I could tell I was going to like it as we pulled into the parking lot. The mountain jutted up out of the plain, so I knew we'd get a fantastic panoramic view when we finally made it to the top. And when we did, we were richly rewarded. One thing I like about the West is that you can truly see for miles and miles. They don't call this big sky country for nothing. It was a great visit, and I'm so glad that Lori made the time to fit me in during such a busy week for her. Thanks, Lori. I ended up living at the Mercedes dealership for a week. The good news is that I got a ton of work done on the podcast since I was pretty much stranded, but had excellent cell service and the office, so it's all good. From Colorado, I head to South Dakota to revisit the Black Hills. As you may recall, last summer, in my ignorance, I managed to arrive in the Black Hills during Sturgis, a massive 500,000-person biker rally being held in the area. It was crazy and crowded and hot, and of course we had COVID, so I decided to skedaddle once I figured out what was going on. But I remembered how beautiful the Black Hills were, and I wanted to go back and see them up close without all these crowds. So on the next episode of the Sophie Diaries, we're going to head to the Dakotas, and then I start heading back east, but via the Great Lakes. I appreciate you using my Amazon link as you do any of your Amazon shopping. Remember, as long as you use my link, which I'll put in the show notes and on my resources page on the activetraveladventures.com website, no matter what you end up buying, if you go into Amazon via my link, I'll get credit for it, and all that helps defray some of the cost of putting on the show and the website, etc. I'd be super grateful, especially now that I'm retired and I don't have a job anymore. So there's a link on this and future podcast episodes. If you're on your phone, just scroll down and you'll find it there. And again, on the website. And I'd appreciate you using it as much as you can. Thanks for listening. Until next time, this is Kit Parks. Adventure on.